Hello everyone, thanks very much for coming. Okay, so as I'm sure the vast majority of you will be aware, we're living in a time of sustainability skepticism. There's been a lot of noise, particularly from the administration in the US, about the drawbacks and the kind of almost the evils of ESG, whether it be DEI or climate action. And to an extent, there's been a lot of kind of negative noise, but there have been kind of real actions taken as well, defunding of the EPA, rollback of climate disclosure requirements, and it's not just in the US. So, for example, in the EU, the omnibus regulation has kind of watered down CSRD. So we are seeing this kind of in multiple contexts in a political environment. And there are certain brands, so for example, Pepsi or Unilever, that haven't completely withdrawn from sustainability commitments, but maybe have moderated them. But I think the question that we want to answer is kind of how much of this is sort of short term, how much is sort of noise, and how real is the effect on consumer demand when it comes to sustainability. And that's one of the questions that we're seeking to answer with the Sustainability Perceptions Index. As David said, this is the third iteration, and there are other questions that we're seeking to answer too. So, as well as trying to work out what the role of sustainability is from a consumer demand point of view, we're trying to address which brands are seen to be the most committed to sustainability on both environmental, social, and governance attributes. Also, what is the difference between sustainability perception and sustainability performance? So, it's interesting that in fact, those are rarely aligned. And so there are some brands that maybe have an opportunity because they're quite good performers but aren't communicating enough. And conversely, there are brands that have value at risk potentially. Which brings me on to almost the key kind of differentiating element of this study, which is what are the actual values attached to those perceptions and that gap between perception and performance. So as David was saying, Brand Finance's Global Brand Equity Monitor study is the basis for our research. So we actually survey over 150,000 respondents now across 41 countries, 31 industry sectors, and over 6,000 brands now. There are some key research questions which I'll just briefly go over so that you have a bit of visibility on the methodology. So the first one is we ask a series of attributes when respondents are reviewing a brand, and there's a whole list of brand-related statements that we ask them whether they associate with the brand or not. And along with that list, which is sort of specific to the sector, we always ask, does this brand act sustainably and ethically, and does this brand support causes I care about? And we use that to derive the role of sustainability at the sector level. And then in addition to that, we ask, to what extent do you agree or disagree that the following brand is committed to the environmental, social, or governance aspects of sustainability? And we use that question to work out the brand-specific scores for perceived sustainability commitment. So then moving on to the valuation methodology. So as I was saying, we use that question on the previous slide to work out the role of sustainability. So we use a technique called drivers analysis. In essence, what we're doing is working out the correlations between all those brand attributes and the level of consideration of the brand. And drivers analysis basically gives you a percentage for each attribute that it gives you the relative explanatory value of each of those attributes, sustainability being one of them. That driver for the sector is then split into weightings for environmental versus social versus governance related sustainability. And then that is applied to the brand specific perception scores and finally to the brand value to give you the sustainability perceptions value, which is in essence the proportion of brand value that is underpinned by a reputation for acting sustainably. I'm very happy to take further questions about this in the Q&A or later. I'm sure it's a lot of numbers to kind of pick up in a few seconds. And then finally, moving on to the gap value analysis. Fortunately, this is actually a bit simpler. So basically, we just repeat that process of valuation, but rather than using the perception scores and the relative position there, we use sustainability performance data from our data partner CSR Hub, which aggregates hundreds of different sustainability performance sources. And so we just take the difference between those two valuations, and that is the gap value. So if that value turns out to be positive, we say that that could indicate green hushing. So that's where a brand is has a performance that is a lot stronger than it's actually perceived to be. So they could afford to communicate a lot more strongly and capture value as a result. Conversely, there are brands where there is value at risk, and so that's where the value is negative. That could indicate greenwashing. So the company's been actively sort of saying things that give them a poor representation of their actual sustainability performance. But often, and perhaps actually more frequently, we find brands will have a very positive reputation and a positive reputation for sustainability without necessarily having actively communicated that. So they can kind of almost drift into a risky position. So it's very important to kind of identify if that's the case and take actions to mitigate that. So moving on to the results. So first you can see here the drivers analysis output for sustainability for a range of different sectors. So you can see that for any sector, sustainability does play a meaningful role. Down at the bottom there, you've got sectors like food and telecoms, where the role is less significant, but still determining kind of 4 or 5% of the overall variation in consideration. Conversely, at the top, you've got sectors like luxury auto, spirits, IT services. Luxury auto is quite interesting. It sort of illustrates a wider trend that we see, where sort of the luxury and premium end of sectors, we find that sustainability is playing a bigger role. There's a variety of different reasons why that's the case. One of them being that where there is something that's a bit more of a discretionary purchase, there's almost kind of more room to factor in sustainability into decision making. And actually, although food is relatively low in terms of its explanatory power, if you look in certain markets, so for example, if you exclude less developed countries and focus, say, on Western countries, or if you look at a kind of a more premium segment of the market, again, you find that the role for sustainability rises there. It's a pattern that we also see in the cosmetics sector. So there's in luxury auto, there's double the role for sustainability versus conventional auto. And in luxury cosmetics, there's a 50% greater role for sustainability than for conventional cosmetics. Also worth mentioning IT services here. We actually do some special research with key decision makers in IT services. And it serves as a quite good illustration for professional services in general. It's easy to think that sustainability is basically just a kind of B2C issue. It's something that kind of, it relates to things maybe that you eat, or in case of cosmetics, things that you directly apply to yourself, where there's a really close connection between the product and sustainability. But actually we find that in lots of B2B contexts, including professional services, sustainability is playing an increasingly powerful role, and that 15.8% is up from 14% last year. Just a quick point on the changing role of sustainability. We have actually seen over the last year a slight decline in the role for most sectors. So IT services is actually a bit of an exception to the rule. So that might lead some to think that, oh, maybe sustainability is slipping down the agenda a bit. Is that a cause of pessimism? But actually, if we look over 2 years, we find that it more or less nets off, and there's kind of it netted it off across all sectors. There actually hasn't been a significant change. So I think the jury's definitely still out as to whether there is any kind of meaningful decline in the role of sustainability. So then moving on to perceptual leaders. So looking first at the industry level, and we've just taken a selection of some particularly interesting sectors here. So you can see in soft drinks, Naked Drinks, Innocent and Huel scoring well across a lot of different markets. Naked and Innocent very much positioned as kind of nature adjacent, very natural, organic. So it's good to kind of see recognition for that there. In Huel's case, it's much, the positioning is about it being a meal replacement. So it's not so much kind of natural aligned, but it's definitely around kind of sustainability, efficiency, etc. Cosmetics is a category that is increasingly defined almost across the board by sustainability commitments. So Body Shop has a very strong reputation and was a pioneer of sustainability positioning in the sector. And that's something that a lot of brands have since emulated. So Roche-Posay and Yves Rocher being good examples of that. In apparel, Patagonia is another pioneer that's recognized in multiple markets. But interestingly, North Face, which has a kind of slightly less direct positioning around sustainability, scores well too. A lot of supermarkets are very sustainability aligned, particularly specialists like Whole Foods and BioCoop and Alnatura from Germany. And then in auto, I guess, again, unsurprisingly, we've got EVs coming top of the list. So Polestar and BYD from China. Interestingly, Tesla used to be at the top of this list, and I think for a lot of you it would be sort of unsurprising to learn that their relative position has slipped a little bit. So BYD and Polestar scoring a bit better in a lot of markets than Tesla now. Now taking a more global view, you can see some of the top brands in some key markets. So in Germany, you've got Bosch and Miele. So they're electronic goods producers, very focused on efficiency. Again, you've got Innocent as well as M&S and Waitrose in the UK. In the US, waste management, so very closely tied to recycling, is well perceived there. In China, we've got BYD. Interestingly, in markets that maybe have a kind of more of a developing understanding of sustainability, you might say, or just a kind of different consumer dynamic to Western markets, you see some names that might come as a little bit of a surprise. So, for example, Etihad in the UAE, Aramco in Saudi, or WeChat. You wouldn't necessarily think, at least based on gut feel, that any of those have a kind of direct sustainability association. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. I think there's probably a sort of halo effect going on there, where if a brand is very, very well perceived because it's got strong loyalty, it's used a lot, so WeChat being a good example of that, that positive perception can actually spill over into sustainability perceptions, even if the brand hasn't been actively communicating. And that's actually an interesting case of where you can sort of creep into that green washing space because you have those positive perceptions around sustainability that you haven't necessarily actively tried to cultivate. But equally, that halo effect can be the result of strategic national importance. So Aramco would be a good case there, where it's felt that there is a very strong, potent kind of social role from that brand just because of what it does. And in Taiwan, actually, we see the same thing for TSMC. So how does that translate into value? Well, here's the top 10. As you'll see, Apple is number one. And I think what it's important to underline here is that the top 10 you see here, in contrast to the slides you've just seen, are not the brands that are perceived to be the most sustainable. They're the brands with the greatest value to manage, or with the greatest sustainability perceptions value. And that's a function of the fact that they have very, very large brand values. They address very, very big markets. But it also does reflect the fact that, one, sustainability matters in their sectors, at least to some extent, and two, they are seen to be addressing sustainability at least to a reasonable degree. So I think the key message there is that regardless of what kind of brand you are and what your positioning is, what your relative position is to competitors, managing sustainability perceptions really matters, and you can kind of damage or lose a lot of value if you don't take steps to address that properly. So now looking at the gap between sustainability perceptions and performance. So on the x-axis, you have sustainability perception, so sort of improving from left to right. And on the y-axis, you have sustainability performance based on CSR Hub data. So you can see I've tried to call out as few brands as possible on the kind of negative end of this chart, but just to cover, don't want to shame too many, but you can see sort of in the bottom right-hand corner, so brands that have a relatively good sustainability perception, not necessarily exceptional, but fairly good, but kind of weaker performance relative to that perception. You've got POSCO, Turk Tuborg and Tesla, still one of those brands that has relatively good perception, but is weak on quite a few areas. Then there are brands that are really not that good on either. So Canada Goose is an example of that, also Airbnb and DoorDash. Then in the top left-hand quadrant here, we've got brands that are green hushing. Microsoft is one of the biggest, but there are plenty of other brands like Red Bull, Banyan Tree, Gap. I think in Microsoft's case, the reason for that green hushing is that it's a very, very large brand. It's quite politically exposed in a way that a lot of other brands aren't, just through its kind of sheer scale. Whereas in Red Bull's case, for example, that may be that they haven't felt that they can find a way to convincingly weave sustainability into the narrative they're trying to tell and the way that they're trying to connect with their customers and other stakeholders. Personally, I feel that there are plenty of ways that they could do that, but that is a point that brands have to be mindful of, is that you can't sort of shoehorn sustainability into the stories that you're trying to tell and the way you connect. It's quite important that you do it in a kind of authentic, natural way. So although many of these brands could stand to gain a lot of value by communicating more, you do have to think very carefully about how to do that authentically. And then finally, in the top right-hand side here, you've got the brands that are doing a good job of performing well and then capitalizing on that. So Guinness is a quite nice example of a brand. Diageo have been doing a lot around sustainability in all sorts of ways, so carbon reduction, reduction of water. And with Guinness in particular, there's been a big focus on regenerative agriculture in Ireland, where a lot of their ingredients are from. Vestas, I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with that, but they produce wind turbines and help to kind of power the energy of the future. So that's unsurprising, and Innocent coming up again as another strong performer there. Here you can see the quantification of that gap. So you can see that Microsoft really, really stands out as the brand with the most to gain through more concerted communication. As I was saying, particularly now in the last sort of year or two, the environment for them has become more sensitive, and actually we found that this green hushing value has actually increased rather than decreased. And we've heard sort of through the grapevine that that's a very, very deliberate strategy of sort of under communicating about what they're doing. But given the strength of sustainability in a B2B context, this is becoming almost more and more of an oversight, or more and more of a dereliction of duty, you might say, to leave quite so much value on the table. Other tech brands are doing similar things, so Google and Apple, but plenty of other brands like Walmart and even Audi could stand to gain. Conversely, there are some brands that have a negative gap value, so they have value at risk. And Tesla is actually a particularly interesting case study, because over several years we've identified this negative gap value for Tesla. So in effect, this value at risk. So in 2023, we identified a gap value of 4.16 billion. So that foreshadowed the actual, the eventual genuine decline in brand value for Tesla. So this gap analysis can actually, for some brands, be quite a useful diagnostic tool. So whether you're an investor or whether you're a brand manager, it's quite interesting to kind of look at this. And although the decline may be indicative, you can see that from 2023 to 2024, the decline in sustainability perceptions value was actually very close to that identified gap value. In 2024, again, we identified the value minus 1.54 billion. And actually, I think even we would have been surprised at quite how much of an implosion there's been in Elon Musk's stewardship of the company and all the kind of resulting scrutiny that's brought of Tesla's practices. So it basically what you're seeing here is the combination of significant brand damage done as a result of Elon Musk's activities, but also the effect of enhanced scrutiny of the shortcomings of Tesla's sustainability practices as a result of all that negative publicity. And then finally, we have another little piece of research, which I won't go into in great depth now, but which we can kind of talk about more over drinks perhaps. But we do another study called the Brand Guardianship Index to assess the reputation of CEOs as guardians of their brand. For this, we survey journalists and financial analysts rather than consumers. And we can see here that sustainability drives a significant proportion of CEO reputation with those analysts, and there are also factors like genuinely caring about employees and inspiring positive change that are kind of significant there too. Sundar Pichai from Google comes out top on environmental sustainability and perceived commitment with that audience. And CVJ from HCLTech, who's very helpfully supporting us with the launch this year, he comes out top on social sustainability with that group. And with that, I will hand over to Thomas for the panel session.